گرانگر همه رفتند خدا تو مرا عشق اگر می چکد از دیده در دیده به ما موج اگر می رود.
Hello. Thank you all for joining us. We should get started now as people trickle in. Salam behameh. My name is Shayan Said. I'm a board member of the Iranian American Bar Association of Northern California. For those of you that this is your first time interacting with IABA NorCal, we are a bar association that has chapters all across the country with a goal to educate the community about legal issues of interest to Iranian Americans and protect and advance the legal rights of Iranian Americans and foster and promote the achievements of Iranian Americans. We are incredibly grateful today to be sponsoring this webinar with Mehrnoush Yazdanyar of Yazdanyar Law. Mehrnoush started her practice back in 2009, and she has extensive experience assisting clients all over the country to comply with and address issues related to OFAC's various sanctions programs. Specifically in assisting Iranian Americans legally transfer over assets from Iran to the US and obtaining licenses that navigate around the Department of Treasury's OFAC regulations to authorize them through prohibited transactions. So we're really grateful for her today to help us have a discussion about how to help send aid to Iran. Before I turn it over to her, I just wanted a quick housekeeping item. There will be a Q&A at the end of this, so if you have any questions, there is a Q&A function that's a part of this webinar. Please do type any questions that you have into that Q&A function. The Q&A portion, Mehrnoush is doing it in English and in Farsi, so if you'd prefer to ask your question in Farsi, please feel free to do that. And then at the end, after Mehrnoush is done giving her presentation, I'll come back on and we'll present those questions to her for her to take one by one. And with that, and without further ado, Mehrnoush John, I'll turn it to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Shayan John, and thank you for IABA's Northern California chapter for putting on this timely seminar. I know with all the events that are happening in Iran, all of us who are outside of Iran want to do anything possible to help. And while the intent behind that is great, it is also important to be mindful of what our obligations are under the sanctions regulations so that there aren't any unintended legal consequences or issues that arise when we are trying to send aid and assistance. And over the last few weeks, we have gotten so many calls and unfortunately a number of issues that have also arisen for individuals who, like I said, with the best of intentions, wanted to gather support and aid for Iran, but unfortunately found themselves, inadvertently violating parts of the regulations. The goal for today is going to be about 20 to 30 minutes where I'm going to highlight the main issues that I've seen, because there's two prongs. One, either people want to help send aid to Iran and want to understand how, what's legal, what's not. And the second prong is we've had a number of individuals who are in the middle of various types of transactions, whether it's non-commercial personal remittances that they were looking to receive from Iran or property that they were looking to sell, that are trying to get their money out, and they want to understand what steps they need to take. So we're just going to start with some of the main, very, very broad overview of the regulations, and then go on specifically focusing on humanitarian aid, what non-government organizations can do, what individuals can do in support of Iran, and then the most important part, your question and answers. This seminar will be in English, but as Shayan said, you can ask your questions in any language you like, and hopefully I'll answer them in one that would be, it's OFAC, so I can't guarantee that it'll always be clear and concise and that you will understand it, but I'll do my best. With that said, we can get started on the presentation. So here we go. So like I said, we're going to start with an introduction of what is OFAC. So I think everyone by now knows what OFAC is. OFAC stands for the Office of Foreign Assets Control. It's part of the Department of the Treasury of the United States that's responsible for administering US sanctions programs. The main body of law that we are most often concerned with, there's a lot of different kinds of sanctions, is the Iranian transaction sanctions regulations when it comes to Iran. If you do have additional questions or if you want to learn about their other sanctions programs, OFAC has a complete list of everything on their website. Who does OFAC's regulations apply to? This is a very important question because while most people understand that the sanctions apply to US persons, there's a common misunderstanding as to who a US person is considered for sanctions laws purposes, as opposed to other definitions that other government organizations, for example, USCIS may have when it comes to immigration regulations. A US person, for our purposes, is any citizen of the United States, regardless of where in the world that they're located. So I don't care if you're living in the Emirates, if you are living in Canada, if you're a US citizen, you need to abide by these regulations. Similarly, a legal permanent resident or green card holder, again, wherever in the world you're located, you are considered a US person and you must abide by these regulations. And then to add, I think what is the most confusing component to this definition is it's any individual that's located inside the US. And where it becomes tricky is that some of these regulations, especially some general licenses that we will cover later, whether or not your transaction falls under that general license may turn on when you became a US person. Now, most of us feel, okay, well, I was a US person when I entered the United States and got my green card, or when I got my citizenship. That's not true. The definition of a US person is any person who is inside, any foreign national inside the United States. So even if at some point you came here on a tourist visa, you came here on a student visa, you came here on a work visa, and that later was converted into a legal permanent residency, the time period that they will look at to calculate or understand whether you are a US person is from the time that you entered the United States. And additionally, for entities, it's any entity that's been incorporated in the United States, and that also includes any foreign branches. So as you can see, unlike other areas and in our regulations administered by various government organs of the US government, US person is a very, very broad definition here. And I always joke, we've done the seminar so many times and everyone's so familiar with this slide. Almost everything is basically prohibited. You cannot import or export any types of good, services, technology to or from Iran. And this is really important because a lot of times people think that this turns on whether or not you are doing it for commercial purposes, or whether or not, what if it's for humanitarian aid, then it is permitted. But it's not that. This is a comprehensive trade ban against Iran. This is very, very broad prohibitions that are put in place. And so even if importation of certain goods for your personal use, whether you want to take it to Iran or bring it here, could be a violation of the regulations. And any services performed by someone in Iran for you here, or someone here for an individual in Iran. This became a very, very big problem during the pandemic, where remote work became so prominent, because a lot of people didn't think that I'm Mehrnoush Yazdanyar, I'm a US person, my employer, Yazdanyar Law Offices, is a US entity, and if I want to take my computer and I want to do work in Iran, but I'm not servicing any clients in Iran, I'm just providing services when I'm in Iran, that's okay. And that could be in violation of the regulations. Most often, any type of remote work would require a specific license. We always tell business entities and individuals, if you are traveling to Iran and you're planning on doing any kind of work, whether it's any kind of collaboration on any projects, if you're taking your work computer, especially if you are in the tech world, you really need to make sure that you have the appropriate licenses in place. And in addition to that, you need to make sure that whatever you're taking on your laptop isn't in violation of any export control regulations, because they are also strict about what you can take on your person outside of the US and into a sanctioned country. And if something is not permitted, then you can't facilitate it in any way. So I get this a lot, where I want to engage in this transaction and I say, well, that's in violation of the sanctions. You can't do that. And this is probably not something that the government would give you a license for. So you can't do that. And I say, well, I won't do it. But what if I put my cousin in touch with this person and then this person does it? You can't facilitate something, you can't finance something, you can't broker something, you can't do anything if the underlying activity or transaction is not permitted under the regulations, and that's very important. Okay, let's see. So it's, if I can ask the participants if they can just send their questions in the question answer box, that will be really helpful. I know a lot of you might be existing clients or have corresponded with our office, but if you could just keep your questions here, we promise we'll get to them before the end of the program. So in addition to certain types of transactions that are not permitted under the regulations that are specific toward Iran, so importing, exporting goods from Iran or services, or limits on individuals who are ordinarily resident of Iran living in a sanctioned country, we have a list of designated nationals that are individuals and entities that it doesn't matter what their nationality is, it doesn't matter where they're located. It may not be Iran, it may not be any sanctioned country, but if that individual is added to the specially designated nationals list, then you as a US person can under no circumstances conduct business or any kind of transaction with that individual, even if there is licenses that the government has allowed for that. And we will get into the licenses, but it's really important, again, for that when you are transacting and anything in Iran, even if the underlying activity is legal in and of itself, it cannot directly or indirectly involve a designated national. And that becomes really important in Iran because so many members of either the Iranian government or various Iranian entities, banks, financial institutions have been placed on this designated nationals list. So you have to make sure that whatever transaction you're engaging in, even if it's permitted, is not involving any of these designated nationals. So finally, we want to get to some good news, which is the permitted types of transactions. So generally, if OFAC wants to allow you to engage in an activity that would otherwise not be permitted, they will issue a license for it. There are two types of licenses. There's a general license. That's for transactions and activities that the government doesn't feel is contrary to US foreign policy goals or their sanctions programs, or the goals of their sanctions programs. What happens is if there's a conduct that they feel like would not be in violation of the point of the sanctions, then they're going to make it legal for all US persons. And the way that they're going to do that is by issuing a general license. I like to think of it as kind of like an exception to the rule. So if there is an activity that the government issues a general license for, that means you can engage in it. You don't need to seek any additional specific authorization from the government in order to engage in that underlying activity. But if you want to do something and there is no general license or exemption that would permit you to engage in that underlying activity, then at that point you need to apply for a specific license from the government. Now, OFAC, I mean, for several years now, has had an online portal through which you can submit your license application. Unlike other areas of the government, this application isn't a form that you can fill out. It's usually submitted in the form of a letter to the government. And you need to, in that letter, describe what the transaction that you want to engage in is, who it involves, exactly what you want to do, and why you feel like you should be given authorization to engage in that underlying activity. It's very important for you to understand what is legal and what is not legal before you apply for a license application. And the reason for that is that one of the major ways that OFAC becomes aware of violations of the regulations is because people inadvertently disclose these violations in a license application. For example, someone will say, you know, I was gifted a property, or I'm going to be gifted a property in Iran. So I want a license to receive that gift and to sell it. And I have a bank account in Iran and I want to deposit the funds. Well, having a bank account in Iran for a US person is illegal. You are not allowed to do that. So in that application process, in the form of a letter, because it's not like a box that you can check, you're probably disclosing more information than you should. And in doing so, you could be putting yourself at risk of violating the regulations. But that's how the process is for applying for a specific license. Some major generally licensed activities that are pertinent, and we're going to get into the ones that are specific for humanitarian aid a little bit later, but a non-commercial personal remittance, which can be seen as a gift or inheritance, It is just has to be non-commercial in nature. It cannot come from a business enterprise or go into a business enterprise. Is legal between an individual in Iran and an individual in the US. So you can receive any amount of money as a gift from someone in Iran. You can also send any amount of money as a gift to someone in Iran, but it needs to be non-commercial and it needs to be personal. It needs to be related to what you are wanting to send. It cannot be something that you're doing on behalf of someone else. And also it cannot be related to any business or family enterprise. The regulations don't state that the funds have to be between family members, but I always tell my clients, you know, if you're saying I'm receiving $500,000 gift and it's from some random person or the cousin of a cousin or just a friend, that's obviously going to get flagged, because who is this person and why are they giving you a gift of that sum? Or are you really trying to receive money that's not related to that gift and trying to, categorize it as something to make it legal? So keep that part of it in mind. Proceeds from the sale of real or personal property that you either acquired before you became a US person, which remember doesn't mean green card or just citizen. Anytime if you entered the US prior to getting your green card, then that's kind of where that's the time period that they will look at it. So it has to be prior to that or inherited after. This question of inheritance I see it a lot, and it's a little confusing to me because, you know, under US regulations, when we say inheritance, someone has to have passed and then you inherited that property. But in the Iranian culture, there's a lot of inter vivos transfers of gifts and inheritances. A lot of times family members gift each other properties or whatever assets they want to eventually give to their beneficiaries. They'd rather do it when they're living to avoid lengthy and difficult probate processes in Iran, as well as inheritance tax issues, but also the uncertain socioeconomic situation in Iran makes it such that they want to gift their property, real personal cash, while they're still living. While sending cash proceeds is permitted, inter vivos transfers of a gift of real property is not. So if the only kind of property you can sell is if you had it from before or if it was acquired as an inheritance after. There is this instrument in Iran that's often referred to as a sole umrah, which means kind of like our trust here, which means you gift the property to the beneficiary, but they're not allowed to have any control over that property. They can't sell the property, they can't do anything while the person who's granting it, the grantor, is still alive. And that in some cases may be okay as long as title wasn't actually transferred. But if title was transferred in your name, then you became a US person who acquired property, and that no longer falls within the scope of the general license, and that would require a specific license. Exportation of certain foods, medicine, and basic medical supplies are permitted under the regulations, but again, medicine and basic medical supplies. We have a lot of individuals who construe that as meaning more complicated machinery, more complicated medical devices. The government has a list of what can and cannot go. And if there's any gray area, you need to make sure that you seek guidance prior to sending anything to Iran. And in often cases, a TISRA license would be required for certain medical devices. So it's also very important for you to look into that. There is a general license that was issued when the uprising in Iran happened, when the protests started, that permitted the exportation of free internet services and software for online communication. That is in place, that is still allowed. Also, importation, exportation of information materials, which information is construed as broad. So books, news, a lot of social media platforms, that's permitted as long as it's for information purposes. So those are some general licenses that we come across a lot. This is an overview for personal transactions that's very important to keep in mind. So the general licenses that allow you as a US person to receive funds from Iran will be a non-commercial personal remittance, which is an inheritance or a gift from a non-US person. And the reason the regulations don't say that the gift has to be from a non-US person, but in practicality, in actuality, if a US person can own and maintain a bank account in Iran, then they can't really be sending a large sum of money as a gift, because obviously that would beg the question, where is this money coming from? So more often than not, gifts coming from Iran have to be a gift from a non-US person, unless a US person is selling property that falls under the sale of property that was acquired as a prior to becoming a US person, or inherited after, or the sale of personal assets that they had before or acquired after, and they're sending that to you as a gift. Everything else would require a specific license. I wanted to put this slide in here because receiving money from Iran, there's so much confusion around it. Like, first of all, people are just not sure whether or not they are allowed to receive funds to begin with. Second, if they are, they're not sure what they need to do to ensure that they don't have any issues here on the receiving side. So I'm going to try to be brief about this because, like I said, I want to focus the majority of the remaining time on the permitted transactions for humanitarian aid. But when receiving funds from Iran, if there's a general license in place, or if you've received a specific license in place, it's very important for you to notify your financial institution in the United States that you are receiving this funds. The reason for this is that, number one, there is no direct banking relationship between Iran and the United States. If you are looking to receive funds from Iran, there is no way that you or your family can walk into Parsian Bank in Iran and wire your funds to Bank of America here in the United States. That doesn't exist. The only way to move money from Iran outside of Iran and into the US is through the use of currency exchange brokers, or sarrafis. The use of a sarrafi, or currency exchange broker, on its face is not illegal. It's permitted as long as the currency exchange broker sends the funds to you from a third country bank, and that you report it here to your financial institution. That latter part, reporting it to your financial institution, is not a legal requirement in the regulations itself. But because when money comes from a currency exchange broker, the source is unclear for the receiving party or the financial institution in the US, they don't know what to do with that. They don't know what this money is related to. So they'll often either block the account, close the account, report it to the government for suspicious activity, or restrict your account until they get additional information. And the reason for this is that the way a currency exchange broker works is that you go and your family gives your reals to the broker and gets US dollars from a third country bank. But the bank and the account that that money is coming from is often either another broker that your currency exchange broker is working with, or a random account associated with that broker. But in both of those cases, it's not an account that's clearly linked to yours. It's a random individual from a random third country that you're receiving funds from. Of course, the bank is going to flag that as to, well, why are you receiving it? So what you need to do is you need to prepare and provide your bank's compliance department with the appropriate compliance documents that outline the source of the funds, the legality of the funds, and you need to submit that to the bank prior to each incoming wire. And this is not to be mistaken with your the branch of your bank, because a lot of times people will go into the branch, and depending on where your branch is located, whether or not that individual working in the front of the office is familiar with these types of transactions and regulations, they may not have the information to give you. They may treat a transaction coming from Iran just the same as they would from a transaction coming from Spain. Why? Because they think, oh, it's an international wire, it's okay, send it. And if our compliance has any issues with it, they'll let you know, not realizing that it's not going to be a clear bank-to-bank transaction or transfer from clearly marked accounts from Spain to the US. It's going to be moving through a third country from a totally random account in a totally random country. So you have to provide your bank with either compliance documents outlining that you're receiving funds under general licenses and why it's legal, or a copy of an OFAC license that you have. And the most important part is, please do not work with a currency exchange broker who is depositing funds into your account from inside the United States. That is illegal. That is what the government of the United States refers to as a hawala. Hawala is a deposit. Hawala is the US coin term referencing when there's this informal money exchange that happens where someone gets reals in Iran and then someone else in the US gets the equivalent in the dollars here. So the broker, instead of wiring the funds from a third country bank, is finding either a customer or an agent to deposit funds into your account from inside the United States. These types of internal transactions are often linked with fraud or money laundering. So when you are receiving money from Iran, the most important thing, please be sure that you work with a currency exchange broker who's going to wire the funds from a third country bank. Once you receive the money, monitor your account and make sure that no portion of the funds were deposited from inside the US. If indeed they were, you need to notify your bank immediately, because that can expose you to fraud, or if you don't know who that individual is. So if they're engaging in any kind of underlying illegal or illicit activity, then your account can go into question by association. So there are certain general licenses that are put into place that permit non-government entities to send aid, humanitarian aid to Iran. So it's General License E, but it's important to understand that General License E is put in place for non-government organizations, not for individuals. This general license authorizes non-government organizations to fundraise, collect donations, and export or re-export certain goods or services to Iran in support of certain projects. And there's a list of the band of what you can and cannot do. So humanitarian projects, which is construed as being very, very limited to very basic necessities to aid with the relief of human suffering, aid to orphanages, food, sending money for food. So sending food itself is often generally licensed for an individual or an entity, but an individual cannot send money to Iran to purchase food. NGOs may be able to do so under General License E. Also included in what is permitted is reconstruction projects for up to 2 years following a natural disaster. However, such projects cannot be for commercial purposes, conservation of wildlife, and then what is becoming very important, because we can construe any aid sent to Iran now under this provision, which is the promotion of democracy and civil society development. So if what the aid that you are looking to send falls within those categories and you're a non-government organization, you are permitted to send up to a cap of $500,000 a year in support of those types of projects. However, you do need to submit quarterly reports to OFAC's licensing division outlining how much money was sent, how it was sent, which is also very important, because while on its face, these general licenses sound great, because of the lack of channels through which we can transparently send and receive money between Iran and the United States, how do you do it? So it has to be either through the use of a currency exchange broker or individuals taking that aid on behalf of the nonprofit. But often that latter one may require a license. So it's important to look into that. But the reason that I'm bringing this up and highlighting it is that it's important for people to understand that while as an individual, you can send money for personal use to your family under a non-commercial personal remittance, you cannot fundraise. The only entity in the US that can fundraise to send funds to Iran without a specific license is a non-government organization. And we've seen this time and time again. Individuals do different crowdfunding events or on Facebook Fund Me, and often those assets get blocked. Why? Because an individual cannot do that. It needs to be a non-government organization. The individual can only send money through, an individual can donate to these nonprofit organizations. You can send food, medicine, basic medical supplies, exportation of internet services, and you need to apply for a specific license if you want to send anything else. An NGO, again, if we want to send the funds, you can do anything that an individual can do, because obviously what an individual can do, all US persons can do. And then we have General License E, that is important. So we had a number of calls that I want to spend a little bit of time, and then I'm sorry, it always goes on longer because I get excited and I want to make sure I cover everything so I don't miss anything, but I think I want to definitely leave a good amount of time for your questions. But we've received a lot of calls for individuals who've had their transactions blocked under Venmo, Zelle, or PayPal because they reference something having to do with Iran. It could be a city, Zahedan, Gorgan, Tehran. It can be fundraising for Iran, help to Iran, aid to Iran. That's going to get flagged because, again, it's going back. While the intent is great, as an individual, you are not allowed to fundraise and send funds to Iran. What blows my mind is that a lot of individuals know this and they do it anyway. And then when their funds get blocked by Facebook, by Zelle, by Venmo, by PayPal, and it's blocked, we can't easily release those funds. You know, they get upset and they say, well, I was just trying to help. And I understand that. But if you are a group of people who want to send money to Iran and you don't want to send it through a non-government organization, then you need to apply for a license. You need to apply for a specific license from the government. In that license application, you need to outline exactly who you intend to fundraise from and how you want to send the funds to Iran. It's very difficult for an individual to just randomly send funds to Iran. First, you need to ensure that the receiving party isn't going to be put in danger. Second, you need to ensure that you can either find a currency exchange broker or Sarafi who's willing to go through that transaction for you. You need to also ensure that funds will not be deposited into that currency exchange broker's account from inside the United States, because if a currency exchange broker or a Sarafi is functioning from inside the United States, I would ask that you ask to see a copy of their OFAC license. I haven't seen anyone who is licensed, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I'm just saying be cautious. I haven't seen a favorable license from OFAC regarding money transmittal or exportation of this type of service to Iran, a financial service to Iran. So if someone is saying, I have a Sarafi in the US and I can send money, ask to see a copy of their OFAC license and money transmittal business license, because that's important. If they're doing an informal currency exchange, then that's not someone that you want to work with, because that informal mechanism will expose you the minute you deposit funds into that individual's account. A lot of people ask if they can send funds through cryptocurrency. In general, if the underlying transaction is permitted, then you can send it through cryptocurrency or digital currency platforms. But again, you would need to clearly state that in your OFAC license application. Now, we have said this when it comes to providing consulting services for anything related to aid to Iran, our office is not charging a fee, and that includes applying for an OFAC license. But I do caution individuals, instead of everybody getting together and applying for like individual licenses, because I don't think that's going to be helpful. OFAC, all it's going to do is inundate an already overworked part of the US government. It's going to cause delays in the adjudication of those license applications. I would recommend either working in groups or finding a nonprofit organization or a non-government organization and seeing if we can make it fit within a general license and just reporting it. Or alternatively, if the mechanism through which you want to send the funds, such as a crypto digital currency, is unclear, we can seek guidance once, get a license once, and do everything and funnel everything through one entity instead of having thousands of license applications be sent to the US government for the same thing. I know it's often difficult in times like this to kind of work together because everyone wants to do something, but I think taking a step back, first understanding your rights, understanding what's permitted, what is not, what steps you have to take to make sure that whatever aid you want to provide, you can do so legally under the sanctions regulations. And second, what's going to be the most effective way of getting that aid there? I think that's all I had. These are some resources that we can, these are also available on our website. We have a mobile app. You can send us questions if you like through that. Obviously, all the various social media platforms. I think with that, we are ready to go to your questions. Shayan, I think if I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if it's good, we can start. I'm sorry if I went a little over, but I still think we have
worries.
a good time.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for all that information. Really appreciate it. We did get a few questions that I think would be good to jump in on. The first one that it goes to something that you spoke about earlier with regards to when a person is considered a U.S. person. Could you clarify or further develop when someone is visiting and here on a visitor visa and here for only for 3 months and then they return home to Iran? At what point are they considered a U.S. person, and then what legal right does that grant that person when they are a U.S. person if they're here on a visitor visa?
Well, the funny thing is you don't have much rights, but you have obligations. So that's where it gets tricky. So when you're visiting on a visitor's visa, technically, according to the definition of the regulations, you're considered a U.S. person because you're within U.S. soil. But the minute you leave, you're no longer considered a U.S. person, right? So where it really becomes important in terms is for that general license for the sale of personal or inherited property. Personal or real property that you acquired prior to becoming a U.S. person. Because let's say you come here and then there's 1% chance that you had some sort of real estate transaction happen in Iran, and you had acquired a piece of property. Later, you immigrate here and you want to sell that property, and it was within that timeline that they granted you a visitor's visa and you were here. Technically, you would need to apply for a license, and they would issue a license for that. I think they just want to control who is acquiring property in Iran and who isn't.
Right.
But where it really matters is a lot of times financial institutions will open a bank account for someone who is here on a visitor's visa. They've gotten more stringent about it now, but prior to like a few years ago, they would just open a bank account for someone even if they were visiting. And while they were within the law to do that, that's not illegal. The minute that visitor leaves, you're not considered a U.S. person. And the minute that person goes back to Iran, that financial institution is now owning and operating a bank account for someone who is ordinarily resident of Iran, and that's illegal. And that's why we see banks routinely ask for your residency information and your citizenship information or your immigration status, because they want to make sure that you don't fall within that. So the main reason I point that out is more for people who come here on a visitor visa, not on necessarily a visitor's visa, but sometimes, but on some sort of work or student visa. And then they end up changing their status to get their green card. They need to be mindful of when their clock starts ticking in terms of their definition of a U.S. person.
I see. Okay. Thank you. And we get a lot of questions about, of course, people want to send aid. And a lot of people look at other prior examples in history of when there's been a humanitarian crisis and see a ton of NGOs and nonprofits doing a lot of work to get aid to them. You broke down a lot how going through a typical NGO rather than trying to get your own individual license is likely the better route. Are there some legitimate NGOs or organizations already in place that are helping Iran that people should look to in terms of if they're trying to donate or get aid to Iran?
So we work with a number of NGOs, and we represent a number of NGOs. But the point that I'd like to really caution people about is often when you are providing aid to Iran on a regular basis prior to the protests, you are often working with another NGO in Iran. I mean, there is basically no other way of doing it. You have to have somebody to receive the funds and some entity that's going to allow you to engage in these humanitarian efforts, build an orphanage, feed kids, help sick kids, whatever it is that organization is focusing on. In a case like this, obviously the government would be able to have oversight over those regulations. And obviously the government is not going to let U.S. persons send aid through these organizations if it means that aid is going to be used in any way to assist the protesters. So it becomes a little bit more difficult. And that's where, and I understand why individuals want to send it more informally. And that's why I tell people, like, let's say I have a cousin in Iran who's, got injured and needs medical attention and aid, and I want to send a personal remittance to that individual. I can do that. I just can't go on Facebook and say, I want to raise money in general for protesters and send money. And I can't even say I want to raise $50,000 for my cousin and his family, because again, that comes out of the non-commercial component. That's why a lot of NGOs are exploring potentially sending funds through digital currency. That could be a good avenue. That NGO just might need to get guidance from the government to see if they can do it that way. Or if there is a group of individuals that want to do it, we can come up with a way, but there just needs to be a channel in place. Like I had a call earlier in the week and they're like, I want to send money. How do I do it? And unfortunately, I can't provide guidance. I mean, I can tell you could do it with cryptocurrency, a currency exchange broker, or you could do it with individuals that are traveling. One thing I forgot to say is when you're bringing money from Iran or to Iran as an individual, if the underlying transaction was permitted, you can bring that money on your person. So if I went and I sold my house and I got $50,000 and it was from an inherited property, I could physically bring that here as long as I reported at the border. But I can't bring money for 20 other people. I can only bring it for myself. That's why then a lot of these non-government organizations have applied for additional licenses that would permit members of their board or their members or anyone affiliated with their organization to be able to take money there. And sometimes they need to report it to the government, or the government, if they ask for it for up to 5 years, you need to keep records of who's taking aid and who is not.
Makes sense. Thanks. We also got several questions that are a bit more family oriented. a lot of people have concern that, because their family often visits, because they still and other family members still visit Iran, that the Iranian government could somehow find out that they have been sending aid to their family in some way, or working to get these licenses to get money to Iran. Do you have any thoughts about concerns around facing fear with the Iranian government finding out your conduct that you have here in the States in terms of sending aid to family, if you come from a background in which you or a lot of people you care about tend to fly back to Iran often?
So the main mechanism that people send and receive funds through is through a currency exchange broker. And because it's pretty informal, like you're not really working through, you're not working through bank accounts that can be monitored on either side. I mean, we are disclosing the information to our banks because we don't want it to get flagged.
Yeah.
But on the Iran side, they can't really for sure tell what is associated with who. So often that takes that problem out of it. If you're traveling and you're taking a lot of money on your person, then yeah, they can hold you at the border and ask any number of questions. And that's why and then also digital currency, I'm not aware of any circumstances that the government could become aware of that. One interesting component is always like there's this fundamental distrust of, well, if I tell the US government, then they're telling the Iranian government because everyone works together, or I don't want to disclose this, or if I'm receiving money and you're telling my bank that it's my cousin that's sending it or whoever is sending it, is that putting that person in danger? In my 13 plus years of experience, I have never become aware of any circumstance where the government of Iran has become aware of in a transaction as a result of us reporting any activities to the US depository institution and or asking for licenses for the government. I would caution anyone traveling to Iran, don't take your cell phone with your entire life on it. Just like the US government can maybe ask to go through your phone, so can the Iranian government. They probably won't ask, they'll just take it. Don't take documents that you can think that could probably be problematic once you get to Iran, or try to bring them outside of Iran. Or if you're leaving the country, if you engage in a major real estate transaction, you should probably send whatever you have to your attorney or whoever that you need to get the documents here to through a secured like email or portal or something like that, versus bringing all of this information with you because you could get checked at both sides of the border.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like a lot of people tend to have anxiety whenever it comes to anything that leads to working or having to deal with the Iranian regime. But it makes a lot of sense that if you're going through a broker, it feels a bit more informal and you're dealing with the US laws and US institutions much more so than you are with the Iranian ones.
Exactly.
We got another question about, in follow-up to your prior response with regards to the example you gave of if you sold your property in Iran and came back on your person with that money. You mentioned, let's say you made $50,000. People are wondering, is there a cap on how much money you're allowed to bring back on your person from Iran? I know, like whenever I fly anywhere really, but even back from Iran on customs, there's like list everything you have that's worth over 10,000 K. With regards to like the rules and regulations following the sanctions, is there a cap on how much money you're allowed to bring back on your person?
So there's no cap, except for the general license with the 500,000. Generally, the regulations are very transaction based. So they look at, is the underlying transaction permitted or not? If it's permitted, you can bring however much you want. If it's not, you can't bring anything. And that's just the general rule of thumb. There is no, and you can bring any amount of money. In the customs form that we have, it says you can take any amount of money outside the US or bring any amount of money that you want. The requirement is if an aggregate of all currency is more than 10,000, report it. And so what we provide for our clients is, so on the Iran side, it changes. I've heard 2,000, I've heard 5,000,
Yeah.
And if that's outside of my jurisdiction, if you feel comfortable bringing cash out, then please check the limits and what you're comfortable with there. But once you're entering in the US, there's no number, but I have found through experiences through my clients over these years, anything more than $20,000, we prepare customs letter for our clients that outlines I'm bringing 50, 60, 70, 80. I had a client bring almost $200,000 cash. I mean, I cannot travel with that much cash on me. I want to be able to sleep. I want to be able to do anything. I don't know. I would freak out, but this person was very, very they were okay with risk. Their risk tolerance was incredibly high.
I
So
can't even imagine what that looked like, physically, what that looked like in a suitcase.
oh, well, I can imagine it because I know, just kidding. I think about it all the time. No. But no, that's what I was so shocked. But we prepared a letter, and he legitimately sold a piece of property. I outlined everything in the letter, and at customs he declared it, showed the letter, why it's legal, and they didn't even give it a second thought. You fill out a form,
Awesome.
and that gets submitted to the IRS, to OFAC, to probably Department of State and everything. But as long as what you're doing is legal, it doesn't really matter. So you can bring any amount and you can report it, anything. And the 20,000, like I said, is not people have brought less and more and have had to deal with questions at the border, but that was just the amount that I have found under that. Generally, if they just explain what it is, it's okay, but declare it. If it's more than that, it helps to have a letter so that the government understands that you were permitted to bring that under all US regulations. But definitely report it. I've heard some very creative ways. When you're coming from Iran, they almost always think you have cash and they will look through your things.
Yeah.
Please report it. Otherwise, you're gonna minimum pay a 10% penalty. And I don't know, in one case, it took us over a year and a half to recover the cut funds for our clients. Wow. Yeah.
Good to know. You also mentioned in another response about using digital currency as well. Are there regulations, whether OFAC or otherwise, around receiving or sending money through Bitcoin, Ethereum, digital currency in general from Iran?
So it's the same type of regulations that apply to transactions involving, U.S. persons that are routed through financial institutions, banks, or currency exchange brokers apply to digital currency. Because it's pretty new, it's it's like 2 years now that people are actually, I know people have been using digital currency for a long time, but I'm talking specifically for bringing funds from Iran. It's been really, I've seen it in the last 2 years. And what's interesting is that, the wallet is created anywhere and the money can go in and out of the wallet. And then it's when you want to put it through like a platform like Coinbase, for example, that then converts it, and when you want to deposit it into your bank account, we've seen instances where Coinbase has questions regarding the source of funds, and we've seen cases where your bank who's receiving it has the same question. So in all of those cases, we've been able to prepare the same kind of documents we use to give to the bank for transactions that are routed through brokers. We do it for the currency exchange. The only part of it we haven't been able to work out a mechanism is through, for example, the company like Coinbase, because they're not there where we can, like for example, if you're receiving funds in Bank of America or Wells Fargo, we know exactly who they're to contact in their department. We provide all the information they need prior it gets cleared. There isn't that same mechanism in place for these different platforms. The other thing to keep in mind is that if someone is ordinarily resident of Iran, so it doesn't matter if they're not a citizen of Iran, but if they live in Iran, a financial institution that's US based, be it a bank or these types of platforms, cannot own and maintain any kind of an account for that individual. And that's why in these regulations, there is a limit that says you can engage in like non-commercial personal remittances, but it can't involve an Iranian account. The definition of an Iranian account isn't an account in Iran. It's an account that an Iranian national has outside of Iran in the US or through any of these companies. And that's where it can get a little tricky. So what I tell people is don't necessarily say, I don't want to do it. Understand it, and let's get information in terms of who's sending it and how. But if it's going to be sent through a wallet that's somewhere, it's not really, wallets are located anywhere. And it took me a while to understand that, to your wallet. And then you're a US person and you're using one of these platforms to exchange the funds and put it in your bank. That's not, as long as the underlying transaction is legal, that's okay. And we need to give your bank the same supporting documents.
Makes sense. We got several questions with regards to the actual logistics of receiving and using a license. So people are curious about like how much does it typically cost to get these licenses, and whether you need an attorney to get them, or is that something that you can do yourself? And then once you have it, what is the actual transfer of the asset look like?
So great question.
Telling the banks and whatnot.
So great question. So no, you don't need a lawyer. So it's like anything else. It's like applying for immigration, status or changing status or forms or applying for a loved one. It doesn't need to be done through a lawyer. But the tricky part, like I had alluded to earlier, is that because these applications are done in the form of a letter, if you're not aware of the regulations, it is very, very easy to inadvertently disclose information that could then result in you getting an administrative subpoena from the government wanting to know, well, more information about whatever accidental, because a lot of people don't realize certain things are not legal. Like they'll say, I had a business in Iran and now I want to sell it. I have stocks in Iran, I want to sell it and bring it, not realizing that all of that is illegal. A US person can't have income in Iran. You can't have shares in anything in Iran. You can't be on the board of directors of something. And then that results in a whole other mess because we have the licensing division that issues permission. And then we have the enforcement division that goes after people who they believe have been in violation of the regulations. So I would just be very cautious of doing that. Then the other interesting part, which I've seen it even when people have gone through a lawyer, is that they get the license, but then they don't give it to their bank or their financial institution. Or let's say you're getting a license to receive goods from Iran that aren't generally licensed. Well, you need to include that license in the shipment. Otherwise, and I get caught at the border. If you send money, because it's beyond me, so many people have come to me after their funds have been blocked because they either worked through an attorney or an accountant or an individual who, as I like to say, ofak for them, which doesn't ofak geraftani means ofak miyad shoma ro migire. So be careful. But and they said, well, he or she got the license and then said, hang on to it. If the government or the banks come after you, show it. And I was like, but that's just not how it works. I mean, the whole point of getting the license is getting authorization for the underlying activity, but also ensuring that you don't have any issues once you're transferring it. And that's why it's really important when you have the license, depending on what the license is. If it's to ship goods to Iran, you need to have it for that shipping company so that they could show it to the border. If it's bringing it, the same thing. If it's receiving money, you need to make sure your bank has a copy of that license. If you're paying fees for something, you need to make sure that they have a copy of that license. So giving it to the proper compliance department. And while none of that requires an attorney, and I always say this is not, you don't have to work with me, work with someone who please knows what they're doing. But you don't have to work with me, but you should work with someone unless you are very familiar with the regulation.
That makes sense.
And also who to contact in the financial institution.
Yeah, it sounds like the area of law is so in depth that whether you're sending or receiving, you're going to run into a legal question that you can handle yourself, but it's in your best interest to ask someone that knows it really well, regardless of the size or where that money is coming from.
Absolutely.
We also got a few questions about individual persons in Iran. So if someone lives in the United States but is fully employed in Iran, do the sanctions also still apply to them?
Yeah, they live in the US. So yeah, they're considered US persons. And I mean, if you're visiting, that's different. But if you are fully employed, that would most likely require a license. So let's say you're here on a student visa, but you have some sort of employment, you would need to apply for a license so that you could either continue your status there until you return or some type of authorization. And also it would really depend on whether you're getting paid or how you're getting paid, or, if money is coming into the US, then absolutely, you need to make sure that it's being done correctly. A lot of these things, like when I tell people, because it's so broad, they're like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. People do this all the time. And because a lot of it goes undetected. Because, for example, if that person comes and is getting paid, they're here on a student visa, they have a 4-year university, they're going to go back to Iran and they have a job, they do some work and then they get paid in Iran. It's really hard for the U.S. government to detect that, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't make it legal. So it's really important to understand that just because people have been doing it without getting into trouble, it doesn't mean that the underlying activity is legal. And then when something happens, like, where something unrelated, like a lot of times universities will come across these types of violations and then they'll report it to the government. A lot of times border patrol will do it if they do look through your laptops, and a lot of times through license applications.
Right, that makes sense. So I do want to be conscious of the time. I'm noticing we're pushing up on 6. There are several more questions, so if you're willing to stay,
yeah, sure, absolutely.
Asking them.
No
I want to let everyone that's here know that this is being recorded and we will have it up on our YouTube channel. So if there's any information in this that you feel like you didn't quite grasp or you want to come back to it, we'll make sure that a link goes out of this Zoom to everyone that's attending currently. The other people are also asking about using a Sarafi in a different country. Are the brokers always, is the broker that we're using always in Iran or always in the US, or can they also use a third country that isn't the US or Iran to broker their money in between the US and Iran? Like along the same lines, and the person's also asking if they know of, celebrities or prominent people in Europe, for instance, that are creating a donation service to Iran. Would that money also face the same kinds of sanctions?
So the first, how about I take the second question first? So
Sure.
in Europe, no, they have different regulations that are in place. Now, if those individuals are US persons, yes, then the same restrictions would apply to them. And I would caution those individuals to definitely apply for a license and make sure they have the appropriate paperwork in place. In terms of the currency exchange brokers, it shouldn't be in the US. You shouldn't work with a broker in the US. You shouldn't receive money from inside the US. That is a big no-no. If there's one thing you're taking away, if there's two things you take away from today, it is individuals cannot raise money and send it to Iran under any circumstances without a specific license. The second is do not receive money from inside the United States that is related to or coming from Iran. It is not legal, it's not permitted. Do not work with a currency exchange broker inside the US unless that broker can prove to you that they have the proper OFAC licenses. And I will for free review that broker's license for you to make sure that it's legal, because this has led to so many issues for our clients over the past 13 years. The second is the broker can be in a third country. I haven't seen that unless like it's the real estate transaction and the buyer has money outside of Iran, a non-US person, and they want to use a broker in a third country, and that's okay too. Again, as long as the money comes from a third country and we report it to the US bank and it doesn't come inside the United States.
That makes a lot of sense. We're also getting a few questions about, there seems to be, of course, naturally some anxiety about like, okay, so we have a lot of basis for how to handle the US side of the sanctions and navigating OFAC and getting licenses. When it comes to, I have my money in a bank in Iran, and I have these licenses that work. Is there ever any issue with regards to the Iran side in terms of getting the money out of the bank there, even if you have a valid license and whatnot? And do you have any suggestions about which banks then as a result to use in Iran?
So what I've heard of is that there's blanket for all financial institutions limits in terms of how much you can withdraw a day. So here's where it comes tricky is like, because I don't know at the end of the day who goes on YouTube and watches this, right? And I don't there are ways that I don't want to in any way provide information that's assisting someone that is going to get in the way of people engaging in their transactions. So I'll give broad answers, and then if you have more specific questions, we can call the office and we can discuss one-on-one. But in general, brokers have found a way like where you can deposit funds into different accounts so that it kind of you can go around these limits that the government of Iran has put in the amount of money that you can withdraw from the banks. But unfortunately, I can't really provide a lot of guidance in terms of what you can do on the Iran side, because obviously, I'm very familiar with the regulations and the transactions, but they are also changing. But my understanding is while there are limits in terms of how much money you can take out, if you work with a broker who is an experienced broker, they can also instruct you in terms of how to get the money to them so that they can send it for you. But anything beyond that, I think it would be beneficial to contact the office.
It's great. I think a general sense that we're pulling from this is work with the right people and you'll likely be able to
never say, I had someone call today and she was like, I've been wanting to sell this property for years and I haven't because I thought I just can't. There are some things you really can't do. You probably can't get a license to go work in Iran, depending on the job or what you want to do. But most of the things you can probably do. It just might take time. We might need to, file applications. We might need to wait for the government to get back to us. But there's always an answer.
Yeah, always. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to end it, Mehrnoush. I appreciate you so much. All of us at IABA NorCal appreciate you so much for doing this with us. I'm sure all the attendees found this very useful. For everyone that's attending, we appreciate your attendance so much. Please do engage with both Mehrnoush and IABA NorCal. More follow us on our socials at Yazdanyar Law and at IABA NorCal. They'll both be posted. We're planning on hosting many more events and try to get really engaged with the community. So please stay in touch and thank you for coming. If you have more questions that you feel like didn't get answered or you weren't fully comfortable asking them in this setting, please feel free to reach out to us separately and we'll get you in touch with the right people to discuss.
Thank you
Merci,
so much.
Mohammed.
And thank you for doing such
course.
an amazing job of organizing everything and for having me. Have a great night.
Merci, Mehrnoush. To you, thank you so much for your time. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat.
Good night.
تو شدی دلیل این که فراموش میکنم دردامو در گوشت میزنم حرفامو توی چشمات میبینم فردامو تو شدی دلیل این که دل من از همه دوره امشبا یادم میمونه نم نم بارون میزد قدم زدیم به سمت خونه بگو یه هایی از کجا پیدا شد تو جایی که همه چی دراماتیک باشه فکرشم نمی کردم بشه با تو رابطمون اینقدر رومانتیک باشه بگو یه هایی از کجا پیدا شد تو جایی که همه چی دراماتیک باشه فکرشم نمی کردم میشه با تو رابطمون اینقدر رومانتیک باشه